You filthy disgrace. Those three words cut through the congressional chamber like a knife. From Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the most polarizing figure on the Supreme Court, to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a voice millions trust to speak truth to power. But behind that insult lies a storm. Over $500,000 in undisclosed gifts, a secret network of political donors worth billions, and a paper trail that could shatter the legacy of America's highest court. This isn't just politics. This is a battle over the very meaning of justice. And today, the gloves are off. The air inside the chamber felt heavier than steel. Every breath seemed to echo against the marble walls, bouncing between the flags, the oak desks, and the sharpened stares of those who knew that today history might shift. Then it happened. The camera locked on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her hands slammed a thick stack of documents onto the table with a thunderous crack, the sound slicing through the murmurs and shattering the fragile calm. "You think you can sell justice, Justice Jackson?" Her voice wasn't loud. It was seismic. It rumbled from the core, shaking the air like the first crack of a storm. Somewhere in the back, a reporter's pen froze mid-stroke. The reaction was instant. Gasps, whispers, a nervous cough in the gallery. The kind of chaos that spreads in seconds when someone finally says what everyone else has been afraid to voice. The cameras swung in unison to Ketanji Brown Jackson. She sat poised, spine straight, hands folded neatly as if she were presiding over the scene rather than standing accused within it. A slow, deliberate smile unfurled across her face. Not the warmth of innocence, but the curl of someone savoring the taste of an unexpected challenge. The smile alone was an answer, a dismissal, a dare. The chairman's gavel struck wood 3 times, the sharp bang, bang, bang demanding order. But order was already gone. Because once the air tastes of blood, no one in the arena cares about rules. Every eye was locked on the 2 women. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to sink into the same pounding rhythm. Jasmine leaned forward, her fingertips pressing into the polished desk, knuckles pale with pressure. Her eyes never blinked. She looked less like a politician and more like a prosecutor about to walk a guilty witness into the trap they'd spent months building. Ketanji didn't flinch. If anything, the corners of her mouth tilted just a fraction higher, as if to say, "Go ahead. Swing." Outside the chamber, the world was watching. On every screen across America, from the living rooms of small towns to the offices of Washington's power brokers, the image was the same. 2 women locked in a stare so taut you could strum it like a wire. And in that wire hummed years of frustration. Years of whispered accusations about gifts, private meetings, unexplained trips, and political promises that never saw daylight. Years of ordinary Americans feeling the scales of justice tipped just a little further away from them. Jasmine broke the silence first. Her voice was steady, but there was a blade beneath it. "You've been entrusted with the highest seat in our legal system, yet here we are, staring at over $500,000 in gifts you never declared. Trips to private islands paid for by billionaires who happen to benefit from your rulings. And now, emails," she tapped the file in front of her, "that suggest your rulings may not have been yours at all." Gasps rippled again, sharper this time, like a fresh cut on already wounded skin. Ketanji shifted her hands slightly, folding them tighter, the only sign that the words had landed anywhere near her armor. Then she spoke, her voice low, smooth, and dripping with the kind of practiced calm that made enemies underestimate her. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, "your performance is admirable, truly, but theatrics don't rewrite facts, and facts will show that your accusations are nothing more than a stunt. For the cameras, for your career, for the court of public opinion." The insult was a velvet-wrapped hammer. It landed without raising her tone, but the condescension in every syllable made the blood in the room run hotter. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't breathe. Her next words came like the click of a lock. "Then you won't mind if we open every single one of those facts to the public record." That was when the chamber truly erupted. Voices overlapped. Reporters bolted for the exit to file the first headlines. Some senators exchanged sharp whispers, already calculating how this might ricochet into their own political survival. The chairman's gavel slammed again, But this time it was swallowed by the storm. Ketanji's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Not fear, no, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of a foe who wasn't going to play by the old rules of politeness and quiet negotiation. The kind of foe who came prepared not just to ask questions, but to land blows. The smile faded. Somewhere in the back row, a photographer leaned forward, sensing the frame of the day, the exact moment when composure began to crack. Jasmine straightened her shoulders, drawing a slow breath, steadying herself for the next swing. Because this was never just about one judge or one scandal. This was about the very soul of the system. And if she had to tear through marble, tradition, and every shadowed corner of Washington to protect it, she would. The tension was no longer just in the air. It was in the bones of everyone present, like the static before lightning finds its mark. Somewhere, out beyond the chamber walls, thunder rolled. And inside, the storm had already begun. Jasmine didn't waste a heartbeat. Her right hand slid to the control panel on the desk, the motion crisp, deliberate. A tap of her finger, and the main screen behind her flickered to life. A wall of black for a split second before the image burst through like a flash grenade. There it was, a photograph so sharp, so damning, it seemed to hum in the air. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, draped in a silk evening gown, seated at the head of an opulent table beneath a crystal chandelier. Around her, a half-dozen faces, but one in particular drew the eye like a magnet. Harold Ainsworth, the reclusive political billionaire whose network of PACs had poured millions into cases that somehow always landed in her court's favor. The room inhaled as one. No one moved. Not the aides, not the senators, not even the security staff. The only sound was the rapid-fire click, click, click of press cameras, each one capturing a frame that would lead headlines within the hour. Light from the screen painted the chamber in stark contrasts. Whites so bright they burned, shadows so deep they swallowed detail. It was the kind of lighting that made truth feel sharper, more dangerous. Some senators leaned toward each other, whispering behind half-raised hands. Others sat back, stone-faced, calculating how far the fallout could spread. On the far side of the room, a young aide mouthed the words to his colleague without making a sound. That's him. Ketanji's eyes lifted to the screen. Her gaze roamed over the photo, unhurried, as if she were admiring a portrait in a museum. Then she turned her head just enough to catch Jasmine's eye. One eyebrow arched, perfectly measured. "I do not comment," she said, her voice calm as rain on glass, "on stolen photographs." The words fell into the silence like pebbles into a deep well. No anger, no panic, just the deliberate posture of someone refusing to acknowledge the gravity of the blow. But in the back of the chamber, a different reaction was brewing. Whispers spread like a virus. Stolen photographs? That's the defense? Reporters scribbled furiously, some already composing the lead in their heads. Justice dismisses photo with billionaire as stolen image. Jasmine didn't flinch. If anything, she leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping just enough to force the room into stillness. "Stolen? No, Justice Jackson. Obtained. From a source who was there that night." Her eyes stayed locked on Ketanji's. She wanted the connection unbroken, the line between them taut enough to hum. The billionaire's face loomed larger as Jasmine zoomed the photo in, each pixel sharpening into detail. The champagne glass in his hand, the subtle lean toward Ketanji, the way her hand rested on the table edge inches from his. "You called it a fundraiser," Jasmine continued, her tone clipped and surgical. "Yet the guest list was sealed. No press, no public record, and 3 weeks later, a ruling in his favor." A murmur rolled through the senators' benches like wind through dry leaves. For the first time, Ketanji's fingers twitched against each other. A small, almost imperceptible crack in the marble facade. The camera zoomed in on her face. Every blink, every slight tension in her jaw was now broadcast to millions. Ketanji inhaled slowly, then spoke, her words carefully spaced. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Congresswoman." The warning was velvet-wrapped as steel. It hung in the air, daring Jasmine to push further. She did. "Dangerous ground is where the truth lives," she said. "And if you've built your house there, Justice Jackson, then maybe it's time the public saw the foundation." Another ripple of gasps. The chairman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between them like a man watching two cars speed toward each other on a single-lane road. Ketanji's lips pressed into the faintest line. Her eyes returned to the photo. Not as a casual glance this time, but as if measuring how much damage it could do if it caught fire outside this chamber. The billionaire's name was already trending on Twitter. In living rooms across the country, viewers reached for their remotes, turning up the volume, leaning forward in their chairs. On some faces, grim satisfaction, on others, a flicker of disbelief. Jasmine let the silence stretch. She knew the weight of a pause at the right moment, how it makes the air feel charged, like everyone is standing on the edge of something irreversible. Then she spoke again, softly this time, but each word honed like a blade. This isn't about a single photo, it's about the rot it represents. Somewhere, a camera flash went off. Ketanji blinked. The storm had shifted. It wasn't just outside the chamber walls anymore. It was in the bloodstream of the entire room, pulsing hotter with each beat. And Jasmine, standing steady in the center of it, was about to draw the next lightning strike. Her hands shifted ever so slightly, sliding a single sheet of paper from the top of the stack in front of her. The paper wasn't flashy, no bold headline, just a neat typed summary of numbers. Numbers that, if proven, could bring down a giant. She leaned toward the microphone, the metal catching the low hum of the chamber. Her voice was calm, but each syllable landed with the weight of a hammer. Did you accept gifts worth more than $500,000 from this man? The words detonated in the room. $500,000. The figure hung in the air like a live wire, buzzing against the marble walls, sparking in every mind that heard it. For a heartbeat, Ketanji Brown Jackson didn't move. Not a blink, not a shift. It was as if the question had frozen her in place, pinning her to the leather chair like an insect under glass. In the press gallery, cameras clicked in a fevered rhythm, the whir of shutters almost matching the pulse in the room. Somewhere near the back, a reporter whispered, "That's the number. That's the one she's been saving." 3 seconds passed, then 4. The silence was so taut it felt as though even the air had stopped breathing. Online, the reaction was instant. Live stream chat boxes exploded in a riot of capital letters. Trey Loig, answer the question. 500K? Hearts raced in living rooms across the country. Older viewers, the ones who had seen decades of political scandal, leaned forward with that familiar, electric anticipation, the sense that they were about to witness history in real time. Ketanji's gaze finally shifted, not to Jasmine, but to the sheet of paper in her hands. Her eyes moved slowly over the page, scanning, as though searching for a weakness in the numbers themselves. When she looked back up, the smile was gone. Her voice came low and deliberate, every word dipped in a quiet, dangerous patience. "I will not dignify baseless accusations with a response." The choice of words was surgical, dismissive enough to signal strength, vague enough to avoid perjury. But to the millions watching, it sounded like a sidestep. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't lean back. If anything, she leaned closer, as though her presence alone could drag the answer out. "Baseless?" she repeated, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. These records came directly from the bank's compliance division. Signed, dated, verified, and each transaction matches your travel itinerary for the past 3 years. The chamber erupted again, voices colliding in a storm of disbelief and indignation. Some senators whispered frantically to their aides. Others stared straight ahead, expressionless, the way soldiers sometimes do when a battle turns bloody too fast. Ketanji's lips pressed into a thin line. A flicker, so small it could have been imagined, passed across her eyes. The flicker of someone recalculating, fast. But Jasmine didn't give her time. "You flew to a private island in the Bahamas," she continued, her voice quickening, her cadence now a staccato drumbeat. "You stayed in a $10,000 a night villa. You attended closed-door meetings with PAC directors, all paid for by the man in that photo." With each sentence, Jasmine's words felt less like questions and more like charges being read aloud in a courtroom. The audience online had stopped spamming in all caps. Now they were simply flooding the chat with a single word: guilty. Ketanji's fingers tapped once on the armrest. A subconscious tick, barely visible. But in a room like this, even the smallest tell was magnified. "I have no further comment on private matters," she said finally, leaning back in her chair as though retreating into the armor of procedural formality. Jasmine's reply came instantly, sharp and merciless. "These aren't private matters. They're public betrayals." The words hit like a second strike of lightning. No one missed the way Ketanji's jaw clenched, the only visible crack in her otherwise composed facade. The chairman's gavel pounded again, the wood echoing like a war drum. But neither woman looked away from the other. Jasmine's eyes were fire. Ketanji's were ice. Between them, the space seemed to thrum with the kind of raw, unfiltered conflict that can't be scripted or contained. And in the back of the chamber, every journalist knew they'd just been handed the quote that would lead every news story for the next 48 hours. Outside, the storm clouds thickened, pressing low against the Capitol dome. Inside, the storm's center was still. The kind of stillness that means the next wave will be even more violent. And Jasmine Crockett, unwavering in her seat, had just loaded the next question. But before she could fire it, Ketanji leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on the desk, fingers interlaced. Her expression was calm, too calm. It was the kind of calm that wasn't born of innocence, but of someone who has been in the arena long enough to know exactly when to counterpunch. When she spoke, her voice was ice, smooth, cutting, unhurried. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, each syllable landing with surgical precision, "you are turning the law into theater." The words didn't rise in volume. They didn't need to. They carried the weight of a dagger, slid across a table in plain sight. Slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. For a moment, the chamber went still again. It was a different kind of stillness than before. Not the breathless pause of anticipation, but the tight, wary quiet that comes when a predator shows its teeth. Ketanji let the silence breathe, her gaze sweeping the room, inviting senators, aides, and cameras to consider her version of events. She wasn't just defending herself, she was reframing the narrative, planting the idea that this wasn't a search for truth, but a performance for applause. Then with a measured inhale, she delivered the next strike. "As a justice of the Supreme Court," she continued, "I am bound by rules you seem to disregard. Confidential deliberations, judicial immunity, protections afforded to maintain the integrity of the court. Protections you now trample in the name of spectacle." Her tone didn't change, but the edge in her voice sliced through the room like winter air. It wasn't the kind of counter-argument meant to answer the question. It was the kind designed to put Jasmine herself on trial. In the press gallery, a few pens hesitated mid-sentence. The pivot was subtle, but unmistakable. Ketanji was shifting the focus, painting herself as the defender of the law's sanctity and Jasmine as the one tearing it apart. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked, unblinking, on the woman across from her. But Ketanji wasn't finished. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice dipping into something almost pitying, "you know as well as I do that judicial immunity exists for a reason. It shields judges from precisely this kind of political theater. Theatrics that may excite an audience, but corrode the foundation of justice." The words political theater echoed in the chamber, picked up instantly by the reporters typing feverishly in the back. She was baiting Jasmine, daring her to respond in anger, to step off the tightrope of controlled questioning and into the pit of personal argument. If Jasmine lashed out now, the clip would be played on loop for days, framed not as a revelation of truth, but as a grandstanding stunt. But Jasmine didn't lash out. She didn't so much as lean back in her chair. Her breathing stayed even, her hands still. Only her eyes moved, unwavering, locked so tightly on Ketanji, it was as if she were holding her in place with nothing but willpower. The room's attention shifted subtly, from the verbal jab to the waiting silence that followed it. Ketanji had delivered her counterstrike, and now everyone was watching to see if it would land. The live stream chat boiled over again. "Don't let her twist it, she's trying to flip it on. You keep going, Jasmine." For those watching at home, especially the older viewers who'd lived through decades of courtroom dramas and political hearings, the tactic was obvious. They'd seen powerful figures dodge the facts before, using the cloak of procedure to smother accountability. Jasmine knew it too, and in that moment, she made a decision. Her lips curved, not into a smile, but into something sharper. A quiet signal that she wasn't rattled, not in the slightest. If anything, she looked like a chess player who just recognized the exact move she'd been waiting for. She leaned forward, mirroring Ketanji's posture, closing the physical space between them in a gesture that was as much psychological as it was literal. "Justice Jackson," she said, her voice low enough to draw the room in, "judicial immunity was never meant to be a shield for corruption. It was meant to protect the bench from fear of retaliation when ruling in the public's interest. But here," she tapped the stack of documents before her, "we have evidence that the interest served wasn't public at all." The murmurs started again, low and steady, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Ketanji's eyes narrowed. The faintest shift, but enough for the cameras to catch. The bait hadn't worked. Jasmine hadn't taken the swing in anger. Instead, she'd used the opening to pivot back to the evidence, back to the money, back to the photo glowing behind them like an unblinking witness. The chairman's gavel tapped once, a token gesture toward order, but even he seemed reluctant to break the rhythm. And Jasmine, eyes still locked on her opponent, let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of her words to settle in every corner of the room. Then, without breaking her gaze, she reached for the next piece of ammunition. Jasmine slid her hand across the table, pulling her laptop closer. The lid lifted with a quiet click, the screen's glow spilling over her face like the first flare of a match in darkness. She didn't say a word. Her fingers danced over the keys, finding a file buried deep within a folder marked only with a date that mattered, a date that could change everything. One more keystroke, and the chamber filled with sound. At first, just the faint crackle of a hidden recorder. Then a voice, cold, confident, unmistakable. "I've got people in Congress protecting me." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The casual certainty in the tone was worse than arrogance. It was ownership. Ownership of a system that should have been untouchable. The reaction was immediate and violent. A collective gasp tore through the room, the kind of gasp that didn't just come from surprise, but from the sick confirmation of a suspicion long held. Several senators leaned forward so fast their chairs scraped across the floor. Others instinctively covered their mouths as if to stop their own reactions from being caught on camera. In the press gallery, a dozen lenses zoomed at once. Photographers scrambled to capture every micro-expression on Ketanji Brown Jackson's face. For the first time that day, the mask cracked. Her brow furrowed, a tiny crease forming between her eyes. It wasn't much, but in a room built on performance, that single muscle twitch was as loud as a confession. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. Her gaze stayed fixed on Ketanji, watching every flicker, every faint tightening of the jaw, every small betrayal of composure. The recording played on. "They'll never touch me," the voice continued, dripping with the smug assurance of someone who believed their power was absolute. The audience in the livestream chat went into meltdown. "She said it. This is the smoking gun. No one is above the law." The sound clip lasted just 17 seconds, but by the time it ended, the chamber felt different, heavier, darker. Even those who had sat stone-faced through the earlier exchanges now had to shift in their seats, their eyes darting between Jasmine, the laptop, and the woman in the witness chair. Ketanji finally moved, leaning back slightly, as though trying to reclaim physical space from the accusation that now hung in the air like a scent no one could escape. Her lips parted, a retort forming, but Jasmine cut her off with a raised hand, the gesture sharp, commanding, final. "There's more," Jasmine said, her voice quiet enough to force the microphones to lean in. "But I think 17 seconds is all the American people need to hear to understand exactly who you are." The words landed with the precision of a sniper's bullet. Clean, lethal. The chairman shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Every rule of decorum was being strained, stretched, and perhaps shattered. But no one dared interrupt. Not now. Jasmine let the silence breathe for 3 beats, then spoke again. "When a justice of the Supreme Court brags about having protectors in Congress, it doesn't just erode trust, it destroys it. It tells every citizen in this country that the law bends for the powerful and breaks for the rest. In homes across America, heads nodded, some in quiet agreement, some in furious disbelief that this moment had taken so long to arrive. Ketanji's jaw tightened. She shifted in her chair, fingers curling once against the armrest. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its icy control. "That recording," she began, "is taken out of context." "Context?" Jasmine's interruption was surgical. "The context is corruption. The context is arrogance. The context is the highest court in the land being used as a bargaining chip." Gasps again, louder this time, emboldened. Ketanji's eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak. And in that silence, Jasmine saw it. The moment when the balance shifted, however slightly in her favor. Because in politics, as in war, there are weapons you can defend against, and there are weapons that, once revealed, rewrite the entire battlefield. And today, Jasmine had just unsheathed one of the latter. The room hadn't cooled. If anything, the temperature was climbing. A slow, relentless burn fueled by every whisper, every camera flash, every mind replaying those 17 seconds on a loop. Jasmine closed the laptop without looking away from her opponent. The soft click of its shutting was almost as loud as the gavel that would follow. She didn't need to say it out loud, but everyone in that chamber knew. The storm had just found its lightning rod. And then the door slammed open. Not gently, not quietly. It swung wide with a force that cut through the tension like a blade, the sound reverberating against the marble walls. Every head turned. Every whisper died. A man stepped into the room, tall, mid-40s, wearing a dark suit that looked sharp, but worn in all the right places. His stride was purposeful, his eyes locked straight ahead, and in his right hand he carried a thick folder, the kind so heavy with paper it bent at the middle. He didn't flinch under the weight of the stairs. He didn't slow his pace. As he approached the witness table, the security details shifted subtly, unsure whether to intercept. But the chairman raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. This man belonged here. He stopped at the microphone, set the folder on the table with a firm thump, and adjusted it so the spine faced forward, the gesture of someone about to unwrap something dangerous. Then he spoke. "My name," he said clearly, "is Daniel Mercer. I served as Justice Jackson's personal aide for 5 years." A ripple moved through the chamber like wind through tall grass. The name meant nothing to the public. Not yet. But to the staffers and insiders, it was a flashpoint. Everyone in the know understood what a personal aide to a Supreme Court justice might have seen, heard, or carried. From her seat, Jasmine Crockett's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Not smug, not victorious. The kind of smile you give when a piece on the chessboard moves exactly where you placed it hours before. Ketanji's expression didn't change much, but the shift was there, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a stillness in her posture that was just a little too precise. The cameras caught it instantly. Daniel continued. "I have here," he said, resting a hand on the folder, "a series of documents, emails, and internal memos directly related to the matters being discussed in this hearing." His tone was steady, but it wasn't rehearsed. This was not a man delivering lines. This was a man carrying a burden he had decided to set down. Jasmine's voice broke the silence, smooth but laced with purpose. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "are you willing to testify under oath that the contents of that folder are authentic and unaltered?" Without hesitation, Daniel nodded. "I am." The chairman leaned into his microphone. "Mr. Mercer, you understand that perjury before Congress is a federal crime?" Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I also understand that the truth is not a crime." That last line hit the air like a slap. In the gallery, someone drew in a sharp breath. In the press row, a reporter's fingers flew across a keyboard. Ketanji finally spoke, her tone still wrapped in control but edged with frost. "Mr. Mercer, you were dismissed from my staff 2 years ago. Is this your attempt at retribution?" Daniel didn't even look at her when he answered. "This is my attempt," he said evenly, "to make sure that the people who trusted you, trusted us, know exactly how the trust was used." For the first time all day, the chamber wasn't just tense, it was leaning. Everyone was drawn toward the center, toward the table where the folder sat like a coiled serpent, ready to strike the moment it was open. Jasmine glanced briefly at the chairman, then back to Daniel. "You may proceed." Daniel opened the folder. The sound of the metal clasp snapping was almost too loud in the silence. He pulled out the first document, a printed email thread, and slid it across the table toward the clerk. "This," he said, "is a conversation between Justice Jackson and a senior advisor to Harold Ainsworth, dated 3 days before a landmark ruling in his favor. In it, there is an explicit discussion about timing, optics, and the assurance that the ruling will align with prior commitments." Gasps, murmurs. A chair scraped loudly against the floor as someone shifted in disbelief. Ketanji's eyes narrowed, the first hint of something colder than disdain flickering behind them. "That document is privileged," she said sharply. "It has no place here." But the chairman overrode her. "It's been entered into the record." Jasmine leaned back slightly, letting the moment expand, letting the weight of Daniel's words settle over the chamber like dust in sunlight. Her eyes found Ketanji's again, and this time, there was no pretense. This was no longer just a duel. This was the slow turning of the tide. Daniel closed the folder but kept his hands resting on it, as if protecting the rest of its contents until the precise moment they were needed. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood. This was not the final blow. It was only the first. Daniel Mercer placed both palms flat on the table, leaning slightly toward the microphone. His voice, when it came, was steady, but there was an undercurrent, the weight of a man who had carried this truth for far too long. "I witnessed Justice Jackson," he said, his eyes locking on hers, "sign a document that guaranteed a ruling favorable to a political donor." The words detonated. They didn't just echo. They ricocheted off the marble walls, through the heavy drapes, into every open ear in the chamber. It was the kind of statement that didn't need embellishment. Its power lay in its brutal simplicity. In the gallery, someone gasped audibly. A senator dropped the pen he'd been holding, the sharp clink of metal on wood somehow punctuating the moment, and then the reaction. Ketanji Brown Jackson's hand slammed down on the polished surface of the desk, the sound like a gunshot. Her voice rang out, clipped and furious. "Ah, lies!" The single word cut through the air like shattered glass. But it was swallowed almost instantly by the roar that erupted around her. The chamber had exploded into chaos. Voices collided, some shouting in disbelief, others in anger, others simply trying to be heard over the din. The chairman's gavel hammered the block again and again, but the rhythm was lost in the cacophony. Cameras flashed like lightning, reporters yelling questions over one another. "Mr. Mercer, can you prove it?" "Justice Jackson, will you step down?" "Congresswoman Crockett, is this the smoking gun?" Jasmine sat perfectly still. She didn't join the shouting, didn't move to calm the noise. She let it wash over the room because in moments like this, chaos itself was a form of evidence. The live stream chat was a flood of disbelief and vindication. "Oh my God, she just said it, lock her up." Ketanji tried again, her voice straining to rise above the uproar. "This man is a disgruntled former employee. But she was cut off by another surge of noise, this time from the senators themselves. Some demanded the witness be allowed to continue. Others shouted for an immediate recess. Daniel didn't flinch. He waited, letting the storm burn for a few more seconds before he spoke again. "I saw her sign it," he repeated, slower this time, each word a hammer blow. "It was in her private chambers. The donor's representative was present. She didn't hesitate. She didn't question. She signed and she handed it back." The details hit like a second wave, this time more devastating than the first, because now it wasn't just an accusation. It was a scene, painted vividly enough for everyone to picture it. Ketanji's knuckles whitened against the table's edge. Her breathing had quickened, just enough for the cameras to catch. The chairman finally managed to quiet the room to a dull roar. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "are you prepared to provide that document to this committee?" Daniel's eyes never left Ketanji's. "Yes," he said simply. Another gasp. The sound was almost theatrical in its timing, as if the room itself understood the gravity of that answer. Ketanji's jaw tightened. "You're fabricating this," she hissed, her tone low now, meant more for Daniel than the microphones. But the microphones caught it. And in the era of instant replay and social media, there was no such thing as an off-the-record moment. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice calm, almost gentle. The calm of someone who knew the ground was shifting beneath her opponent's feet. "Justice Jackson," she said, "are you denying under oath that you signed such a document?" It was a trap, a perfect one. If Ketanji said yes, she'd be opening herself to perjury if the document surfaced. If she said no, the silence would speak volumes. The pause was brief, but in that pause the entire chamber seemed to lean forward, waiting. "I am saying," Ketanji began carefully, "that this is a malicious fabrication." But she didn't get to finish. Daniel reached down, pulled a sealed envelope from the folder, and placed it on the table in front of the clerk. "This," he said, "is a certified copy. The original is in secure custody." The clerk's hands trembled slightly as they took it. Even they knew the weight of what they were holding. In that moment, the noise in the chamber didn't rise. It fell into the kind of silence that isn't peaceful at all, but heavy and suffocating. Because everyone knew, whatever was inside that envelope, it would not just answer questions, it would end careers. Jasmine finally allowed herself a full smile, not gloating, but the kind of smile that comes when you see the finish line after a brutal race. Ketanji, for the first time all day, looked away, and the cameras caught it. The moment was small, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough for the nation watching at home to feel that subtle shift in power, the turning of the tide. Jasmine saw it too. She didn't pounce immediately. She let the silence swell, let the tension coil tighter, until the entire room seemed to lean forward in anticipation of what came next. Then with the precision of a surgeon, she reached for another file in the stack before her. The red tab marked "Financial Records" seemed to glow under the chamber lights. She opened it slowly, deliberately. A performance for the cameras, for the senators, for the millions tuned in live. Every eye followed the movement, every breath in the room synced to hers. Without a word, she slid a set of printed documents across the table toward the clerk. Then she spoke. "These," she said, her voice calm but resonating with authority, "are bank statements from the past 3 years. They detail multiple wire transfers from accounts linked to Harold Ainsworth's network of shell companies." She paused, long enough for the weight of the name to land again. "And here," she tapped the top page, "you'll see one dated exactly 72 hours before the Supreme Court ruling in Ainsworth versus United States, a ruling authored by Justice Jackson herself." A ripple moved through the chamber. Not the sudden roar of shock, but the low, steady murmur of recognition. It was the sound of pieces clicking into place. The clerk adjusted his glasses, scanning the first page, then the second. Even at a distance, the figures were unmistakable. 6 digits, bold and damning. Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes locked on Ketanji. "The amount," she continued, "was $275,000, and the memo line reads—" She glanced briefly at the document. "Final agreement." The words landed like a hammer blow. Across the room, a senator from the opposition party muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the nearest microphones to catch, "This goes way beyond what we imagine." The press gallery erupted in a flurry of camera clicks, the sound like rain on a tin roof. On the live stream, the chat exploded again. "There it is, caught in 4K. She's done for the first time." The mask on Ketanji's face began to show cracks big enough for the cameras to capture clearly. A twitch at the corner of her mouth, a tightening of her jaw, the faintest flare of her nostrils. The image would be replayed endlessly in the hours to come. A freeze frame of the moment control began to slip. Ketanji inhaled sharply, then tried to recover. "These are fabricated," she said, her voice louder now, meant to reclaim ground. "Anyone can create false statements. This is a smear campaign." But Jasmine didn't let her finish. She leaned in, her tone cutting through the room like a razor. "These statements," she said, "were obtained directly from the bank under subpoena. They are certified, time-stamped, and verified by the compliance department. If you'd like to accuse the bank of forgery, Justice Jackson, I'm sure the CEO will be interested to hear it." A collective ooh rolled through the gallery. Even some of Ketanji's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jasmine didn't relent. And if that wasn't enough, she added, pulling a second set of papers from the file, here is another transfer, this one for $180,000, dated 48 hours before the ruling in Ainsworth versus State of New York. The numbers were stacking up, and everyone in the room could feel it. This wasn't a single questionable transaction anymore. This was a pattern, deliberate, repeated, undeniable. Ketanji's fingers tapped against the table, an unconscious rhythm that betrayed the storm brewing beneath her measured tone. You are twisting coincidences into conspiracies, she said, her voice dropping into something cold and almost desperate. Jasmine's reply came instantly, without a flicker of hesitation. Coincidences don't leave a paper trail this clear, and conspiracies don't crumble under cross-examination, unless, of course, they're real. The chairman's gavel came down once, twice, but it was half-hearted. He knew the hearing had shifted beyond his control. This was no longer about decorum, but about survival. Political, legal, personal. In the gallery, the air felt thicker, as though the weight of the evidence was pressing down on everyone at once. And for the first time in her career, Ketanji Brown Jackson looked less like an untouchable pillar of justice, and more like a defendant waiting for the verdict. Jasmine slid the rest of the bank statements back into the folder, tapping the cover once before setting it aside. The gesture was final, but it wasn't the end, because everyone in that room knew she still had more to come. Ketanji opened her mouth, ready to launch another rebuttal, her voice poised to reclaim the floor. But she never got the chance. Jasmine's hand moved like a strike. From the inner pocket of her blazer, she pulled a single sheet of paper encased in a clear plastic sleeve, a preservation method reserved for documents that could burn a career to ash. She placed it flat on the table, angled perfectly toward the cameras. No theatrics this time. The evidence would speak for itself. This, Jasmine said, her voice steady as stone, is an original email never before made public. It has been authenticated by the National Archives and cross-verified by 2 independent forensic document examiners. The room shifted. Chairs creaked, bodies leaned forward. Even the stenographer's fingers seemed to pause above the keys. Jasmine let the anticipation stretch for just a breath longer before continuing. It is from Harold Ainsworth's chief legal counsel to Justice Jackson, dated 5 days before the ruling in Ainsworth versus United States. She picked up the page, reading slowly, each word a deliberate incision. This case will be resolved as promised. The sentence hung there, simple but lethal. No qualifiers, no wiggle room. It wasn't just implication, it was confirmation. A shockwave rippled through the chamber. Some senators stared down at their desks, unwilling, or unable, to look at the witness stand. Others locked their eyes on Ketanji, their expressions somewhere between disbelief and grim recognition. In the gallery, the public reaction was instant. Several attendees gasped audibly. Others muttered curses under their breath. The press gallery erupted in a flurry of activity, reporters firing off breaking news updates like gunfire. And then, faint at first but growing with each second, the sound began. From outside the chamber, muffled through walls and heavy doors, came the chant, "Resign, resign, resign." The words grew louder, clearer, a tidal wave of public fury that had been building for years and had finally found its breach. Ketanji's jaw locked tight, but the rest of her betrayed her. The faint twitch in her eyelids, the way her left hand shifted fractionally toward her glass of water, and then stopped. The cameras caught it all. This email, Jasmine continued, holding the page up so the seal of authentication was visible to every lens, isn't circumstantial. It isn't conjecture. It is a written record of a promise, and a promise kept, in direct violation of the public trust and the Constitution you swore to uphold. Her tone didn't rise, but it sharpened, cutting through the noise like a scalpel. You didn't just bend the law, Justice Jackson. You sold it. Gasps. One senator audibly muttered, "God help us," into his microphone, not realizing it was still on. Ketanji tried to speak, but the chants from outside had grown too loud now, bleeding into the chamber with the weight of inevitability. "Resign! Resign! Resign!" Jasmine didn't look away from her. Her eyes were locked, unwavering, holding the justice in place like a pinned butterfly under glass. "I warned you," Jasmine said, softer now but every bit as lethal, that no one is above the law. Today you've proven why that warning exists. The chairman's gavel hammered once, twice, 3 times, but it was hopeless. Order had been replaced by history in the making. The sound in the chamber wasn't just noise anymore. It was the echo of a verdict forming, long before any formal vote or ruling. Ketanji sat back in her chair, her expression a war between rage and calculation. But even she seemed to understand. The narrative had slipped beyond her grasp. Whatever happened next, the image of that email, held aloft for the nation to see, would outlive her defense. Jasmine slid the document back into its protective sleeve, placing it gently on the stack beside her. She didn't rush. She didn't gloat. She simply let the room breathe in the reality of what had just been revealed. Outside, the chants continued, relentless. Resign! 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 And somewhere in the gallery, an older man in a worn veteran's cap stood and saluted Jasmine Crockett. A silent gesture of gratitude seen by few but felt by many. The storm had not just found its lightning rod, it had found its strike. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, not quickly, not with the hurried energy of someone chasing momentum, but with the measured certainty of a woman who knew she now owned the room. The chants outside the chamber still pounded against the walls, each one a drum beat feeding the gravity of the moment. Resign! 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 Their echo seeped through the heavy doors like water finding cracks in stone. Jasmine didn't glance at the senators. She didn't look to the witness table where Ketanji Brown Jackson sat, rigid, her eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the cameras. Instead, Jasmine turned directly to face the largest lens in the room, the one broadcasting live to every corner of the country. Her voice, when it came, was calm, controlled, but it carried a weight that made every syllable feel like it was carved from granite. No one, she said, her eyes steady, is above the law. No one. Aham. The silence after those words was total. The kind that swallows sound whole. Even the shuffling of papers, the quiet hum of equipment, seemed to vanish. It was as if the chamber itself had leaned in to hear the echo. And outside, the chant changed. From resign to the new rallying cry, thousands of voices repeated her words in unison. No one! No one! Inside, the weight of the declaration settled on every person present. It wasn't just a line for the cameras. It was the kind of truth that, once spoken aloud in a moment like this, refuses to die. In the press gallery, reporters exchanged quick, knowing glances. They'd just been handed the headline, the quote that would be replayed across networks, printed on front pages, clipped into political ads, etched into the memory of this day. One of them typed it out in bold in the middle of their draft. No one is above the law, Crockett. On social media, it ignited like dry grass under a match. Within minutes, the hashtag #YourNoOne climbed the trending charts. By the time Jasmine sat back down, it was already the #1 topic nationwide, overtaking celebrity gossip, sports, and even the weather disasters that had dominated the week. But in the chamber, the impact was deeper than likes and shares. Ketanji shifted in her chair, her composure fraying at the edges. The corners of her mouth pressed into a tight line, and her left hand gripped the armrest hard enough for her knuckles to pale. She didn't respond, not yet, because anything she said now would be set against that line, and nothing could eclipse it. Jasmine knew it. She didn't smile, didn't look triumphant. She simply let the moment breathe, the air thick with the knowledge that this was bigger than a political skirmish. It was a public reckoning. A senator 2 rows back leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "That's it. That's the soundbite that buries her." The colleague only nodded, eyes still fixed on Jasmine. The chairman, sensing the shift, cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. Even he seemed to understand that procedural rules were irrelevant when history was being written in real time. Jasmine finally broke her gaze from the camera, turning her attention back to the committee. "When we allow power to hide behind its own privilege," she said, "we lose the very thing we swore to protect. If we don't act, if we let this slide, then we are complicit, and I, for one, will not be complicit." The declaration rang out, not as a plea, but as a warning to every person in that room and to every viewer at home who'd ever felt the weight of a system tilted against them. In the audience, an older woman in a faded civil rights pin dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her, a young man in a military uniform sat straighter, his jaw clenched in quiet solidarity. Ketanji finally turned her gaze back to Jasmine. But now it wasn't the stare of a confident opponent. It was the measured, almost wary look of someone assessing a threat they could no longer dismiss. Outside, the chants still echoed. Inside, the echo of Jasmine's words lingered in the marrow of the room. And somewhere in the tangled web of politics, media, and public perception, a line had been crossed. Not by scandal, but by truth, spoken plainly, in the full light of day. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her hands folding neatly on the table in front of her. Her work in that moment was done, but the ripple she'd set in motion was only beginning. Across the room, Ketanji Brown Jackson sat perfectly still for a long beat. The kind of stillness that isn't about calm but calculation. Her eyes swept over the committee, the audience, the press, all of them watching, waiting to see what she would do next. Then, without a word, she pushed back her chair. The scrape of its legs against the polished wood was sharp, almost jarring after the heavy silence that had settled over the chamber. She rose to her full height, smoothing the front of her jacket with deliberate precision. No one spoke. Even the rustle of papers in the gallery died down. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. Ketanji began gathering her notes, stacking them in perfect alignment, her movements unhurried. It wasn't the hurried shuffle of someone retreating under fire. It was the slow, meticulous rhythm of someone who wanted to choose the terms of their own exit. Each page slid into her folder with a soft whisper of paper on paper. Her pen clicked shut. The clasp on her briefcase snapped with a sound far louder than it should have been. When she finally lifted her eyes, they went not to the chairman, not to the cameras, not to the cluster of aides waiting nervously by the door, but straight to Jasmine Crockett. The look wasn't one of fear. It wasn't even defiance in its pure form. It was something more dangerous. A promise that this wasn't over. Her gaze lingered for a fraction too long, the unspoken message passing like a silent telegram between enemies who knew this was just the opening battle. It was the look of someone marking her opponent, committing her to memory not as a political adversary, but as a long-term target. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her posture remained exactly as it had been, hands folded, eyes steady. She accepted the look without returning fire, because she knew, in politics, silence could be the sharpest blade. Outside, the chant still echoed faintly, muffled by the walls but undeniable. Inside, the quiet was so complete that the click of Ketanji's heels on the marble floor sounded like a metronome, marking the seconds until the next chapter of this war. As she passed the row of senators, a few leaned back instinctively, as if to avoid being brushed by the tension trailing behind her. Others met her eyes briefly, only to look away just as quickly. She didn't rush. She didn't glance at the press gallery. Her steps were measured, each one striking the floor with just enough force to suggest that this exit was hers to own. Not a concession, but a calculated withdrawal. The heavy doors at the end of the chamber swung open. A gust of cooler air swept in, stirring the edges of the papers on the desks. Ketanji paused in the doorway. One hand gripped the briefcase, the other rested lightly against the frame. She turned her head just slightly, enough for the cameras to catch her profile. And her eyes once again found Jasmine. It was the same look as before. Only now, framed in the doorway, it carried the weight of a vow. Then she was gone, the doors closing behind her with a deep, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate in the floor. For a few seconds, no one moved. The room remained frozen, as if unsure whether the scene had truly ended or if something else might break loose. Jasmine inhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling in a measured rhythm. She didn't smile. She didn't reach for her water. She simply sat there, letting the silence after Ketanji's departure stretch as far as it needed to. In that silence, the significance of what had just happened settled over the room like dust after a collapsed building. It wasn't just that a Supreme Court justice had walked out under a cloud of scandal. It was that the entire country had seen it live. Somewhere in the back row, an aide whispered to a colleague, "We're going to be talking about this for the next 20 years." The colleague only nodded, eyes still fixed on Jasmine, because even with Ketanji gone, the battle wasn't over. The ripple she'd set in motion was already widening, touching corners of power that hadn't felt this kind of threat in decades. And Jasmine Crockett knew. The next wave was coming. The cameras cut to black. But the battle didn't end when the red lights went off. The hallway outside the hearing chamber had already transformed into a war zone of flashing bulbs, shouted questions, and the frantic scramble of news crews jostling for position. Boom mics swung like fishing poles over the crowd, straining to catch the next soundbite that might define the day. Reporters surged forward the moment Jasmine stepped through the heavy oak doors, their voices colliding in a chaotic chorus. "Congresswoman, is this enough to start impeachment proceedings? Do you believe Justice Jackson will resign? Was this all coordinated ahead of time?" Jasmine didn't stop walking. Her security detail flanked her, clearing just enough space for her to move through the crush. But she didn't hide behind them. She stayed visible, meeting the cameras with the same unwavering gaze she'd worn inside the chamber. From one side of the hall came the chants. Her supporters had gathered in a tight cluster, their voices rising above the chaos. "No one is above the law. No one." Some held handmade signs with her name. Others waved copies of the morning's headlines, now rendered outdated within a single afternoon. On the opposite side, the energy was different. Ketanji's allies kept their heads low, their steps quick. Some avoided eye contact entirely, slipping away down side corridors as if distance might shield them from the fallout. Their silence spoke louder than any statement could. The two currents, one surging with triumph, the other retreating into damage control, collided in the narrow hallway, and the tension was palpable. Jasmine kept moving. Her pace was steady, her posture unshaken. Every camera followed. Every journalist fought to stay in step. Near the end of the corridor, a voice rose above the din, deep, booming, and filled with conviction. "This is the biggest fight for justice we've seen in a generation." The speaker was an older man in a worn leather jacket, his Vietnam veteran cap tilted back on his head. He didn't carry a camera or a microphone, just the weight of someone who had seen enough history to know when it was being made again. Jasmine paused. Just for a moment, she turned her head toward him, gave a single nod, and then moved on. It wasn't for the cameras. It was an acknowledgement, person to person, of the deeper stakes in play. As she reached the marble staircase, the sound shifted. Through the tall windows at the far end of the hall, the faint hum of engines could be heard. A convoy of black SUVs idled at the curb, the center vehicle's rear door open. Ketanji emerged from a side door across the rotunda, her aides forming a shield around her. No press shouted questions in her direction. The few who tried were met with the cold wall of her silence. She didn't look toward Jasmine, not at first. But just before stepping into the SUV, she turned. Their eyes met across the expanse of marble and noise. It lasted no more than 2 seconds, but in that locked gaze was the entire weight of the day. The blows landed. The ground gained. The battle still to come. No words passed. They weren't needed. Then Ketanji ducked into the vehicle, the door shutting with a heavy thud. The convoy pulled away, the sound of its engines fading into the city beyond. Inside the Capitol, the chaos persisted. Staffers hurried past with phones pressed to their ears. Reporters filed updates in real time, and the social media feeds buzzed with clips, quotes, and theories. Already the narrative was taking shape. On news tickers across the country, the phrase "the Justice Showdown" scrolled in bold letters. Cable anchors called it the biggest judicial confrontation in modern history. But on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, it had taken on a different name. One born not in the newsroom but in the crowd outside. The Justice War of the Decade. It wasn't just trending, it was exploding. Clips of Jasmine's "No one is above the law" declaration were being remixed into music tracks, stitched into viral videos, and shared by public figures far beyond politics. In coffee shops, on subway platforms, in offices across America, people were talking. Not about whether Ketanji would survive the scandal, but about what it meant if she didn't. Back in the hallway, Jasmine finally stepped into a quieter side room. Her aides closed the door behind her, shutting out the noise. For the first time since the gavel had struck that morning, she let out a slow, deep breath. The kind that doesn't signal relief, but readiness. Because she knew what everyone else was just beginning to realize. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the end of the beginning. And outside those walls, the aftershocks of this day were already rolling across the country, each one building towards something even bigger. In the end, the battle between Jasmine and Ketanji was not just about law or politics. It was about the timeless choice between integrity and corruption, courage and compromise. Justice is not an abstract idea. It lives and breathes in the actions of those willing to defend it, even when the cost is high. When power is tested and truth is on trial, the measure of a society is not in its words, but in whether its people will rise to protect what is right. If this clash between Jasmine Crockett and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson made your heart race, don't just move on, think about it, talk about it. Pass it to someone who knows that justice dies in silence. Like, comment, and share it with those who still believe the truth should never bow to power. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where every word cuts through the noise and no shadow stays unchallenged. Hit the bell, because the next chapter isn't polite. It's sharp, it's fearless, and it might change how you see the fight for what's right. This story is a fictional dramatization, inspired by real patterns of corruption and real acts of courage. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental or symbolic, meant to spark reflection and accountability. Thanks for watching. Justice isn't a gift, it's a fight. This is Harrison Stories.